What if I told you that a 13-year-old girl would become the key to unraveling one of Ohio's most disturbing murder conspiracies? What if I told you that behind the walls of ordinary suburban homes, two women were plotting deaths so calculated, so cold-blooded, that even seasoned detectives would struggle to comprehend the depth of their depravity? And what if I told you that the very children these women raised would ultimately become both their victims and their undoing? This is the story of Stacey Castor. No, this is darker. This is the story of the Clarke and Straub suffocation killings of 2011, a tale that begins not with a scream, not with a gunshot, but with a pillow pressed firmly over the face of a disabled man who couldn't fight back, who couldn't call for help, who could only lie there as the life was slowly, methodically squeezed from his body. I'm about to take you into the heart of Stark County, Ohio, where two women formed an unholy alliance built on greed, manipulation, and murder, where insurance policies became death warrants, where the most vulnerable members of society became targets, and where justice, though delayed, would eventually come crashing down like a hammer of divine retribution. But here's what keeps me up at night, what will keep you watching until the very last frame of this story. These women didn't just kill, they planned, they waited, they smiled at funerals they had orchestrated, they collected checks written in blood, and they would have gotten away with all of it, every single murder, if not for one brave teenage girl who refused to let the dead stay silent. Before we go any further, I need you to do something for me. If you believe that true crime stories matter, that the victims of these horrific acts deserve to have their stories told, I need you to hit that subscribe button right now. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this story, because the victims I'm about to introduce you to, they can't speak for themselves anymore. But we can speak for them. We can make sure their deaths meant something, that their killers face the full weight of public judgment for what they did. Now let me take you back to a small town in Ohio where everyone thought they knew their neighbors, where church bells rang on Sunday mornings, and where two women were already calculating their next kill. Stark County, Ohio, in the early 2000s, was like 1,000 other American communities. Working-class families doing their best to get by, modest homes with chain-link fences, Friday night football games, and Saturday morning yard sales. It was the kind of place where people waved to each other from their porches, where gossip traveled faster than any news broadcast, and where everyone assumed that the greatest dangers lay somewhere else, in big cities, in far-off places, anywhere but here. Into this landscape of assumed safety stepped two women whose paths would intersect in ways that would shatter families and leave a trail of bodies in their wake. Their names would become synonymous with a particular kind of evil, the evil that wears a friendly face, that brings casseroles to grieving neighbors, that speaks softly and carries murder in its heart. The first woman, let's call her the architect. She was the one who understood how the system worked, how insurance policies were written, how death investigations were conducted, and most importantly, how to exploit the gaps in that system. She had spent years studying her craft, not in any classroom, but through careful observation and cold calculation. She knew that suffocation leaves few traces. She knew that disabled victims were often assumed to have died of natural causes. And she knew that grief was the perfect disguise for guilt. The second woman was the executor. She was the hands that did the dirty work, the presence in the room when the pillow came down. She was drawn into the partnership not by ideology or even by innate cruelty, but by something far more mundane: money. In her mind, she had found a solution to all her financial problems, a way to escape the grinding poverty that had defined her life. All she had to do was help end a few lives that, in her warped reasoning, weren't really worth living anyway. Together, these two women would form a partnership that defied everything we think we know about female killers. They weren't motivated by passion or revenge or self-defense. They weren't protecting their children or escaping abusive relationships. They were simply entrepreneurs. Death was their product, insurance money was their payment, and human beings were reduced to nothing more than opportunities waiting to be exploited. The stage was set in a modest home where a disabled man lived under what should have been the protection of family. He was dependent on others for his most basic needs, vulnerable in ways that most of us can barely imagine. His disability had stripped away his ability to defend himself, to call for help, to even fully understand the danger that was creeping ever closer. To his killers, these weren't tragedies that should have inspired compassion. They were features that made him an ideal target. The insurance policy had been taken out months before. The beneficiaries had been carefully chosen. The method had been discussed, refined, and agreed upon. All that remained was the execution, a word I use with full awareness of its double meaning. Because make no mistake about what I'm describing here. This wasn't manslaughter. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was an execution, carried out with the same cold efficiency as any state-sanctioned death, but without any of the legal safeguards, without any of the appeals processes, without any chance for the victim to speak in his own defense. On the night it happened, there were no witnesses. At least, none that the killers knew about. The act itself was almost anticlimactic in its simplicity. A pillow, a few minutes of pressure, a body that went limp, and then it was over. A human life, with all its complexity, all its potential, all its inherent dignity, reduced to nothing more than a corpse that would soon generate a payout. The women who committed this act didn't flee, they didn't panic, they simply waited. Waited for morning, waited for the discovery, waited for the ambulance that would come too late to save anyone. And when the questions came, they had their answers ready. Natural causes, his disability, his weakness, his time had simply come. And here's the thing that should terrify you. It worked. The first death raised no red flags. The insurance money came through. The killers walked free, not just free from suspicion, but emboldened by their success. They had gotten away with murder, and in their minds, that meant they could do it again, and again, and again. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly have anticipated, was that someone was watching. Someone was remembering. Someone was keeping track of the deaths that seemed just a little too convenient, the insurance policies that seemed just a little too prescient, the grief that seemed just a little too performed, and that someone was just a child, a 13-year-old girl, who would grow into the young woman who would eventually bring this entire house of cards crashing down. Justice was coming. It just didn't know it yet. To understand how Judith Hawkey became a victim, you have to understand what it means to be truly vulnerable in America. You have to understand how our systems fail the people who need them most, And you have to understand how predators recognize and exploit that vulnerability with a precision that would be impressive if it weren't so horrifying. Judith was 70 years old when she died. 70 years of life, of memories, of relationships, of small joys and large sorrows. All of it reduced to a line item on an insurance form. She had lived through decades of American history, had raised children, had weathered losses that would have broken weaker souls. And in the end, she found herself dependent on people who saw her not as a mother, not as a grandmother, not as a human being with inherent worth, but as an opportunity. Her disabilities had accumulated over time, as they do for so many elderly Americans. What began as minor inconveniences became major limitations. What had once been temporary conditions became permanent realities. By the time she entered the final chapter of her life, she needed help with almost everything: eating, bathing, moving from one room to another. She was trapped in a body that had become her prison, and she was wholly dependent on her jailers. This is where the story takes its first dark turn, because the person who was supposed to be caring for Judith, the person who had legal authority over her well-being, was the very person who would orchestrate her death. In true crime, we talk a lot about stranger danger, about the killers who lurk in shadows and strike from darkness. But the statistics tell a different story. The statistics tell us that the most dangerous person in your life is often the person closest to you, the person you trust, the person you love. For Judith, that person was family. And that family had debts, had frustrations, had a creeping resentment that grew day by day as the burden of caregiving wore them down. I'm not making excuses here, not even trying to explain what can never be explained. I'm simply telling you what investigators would later piece together. That the decision to kill Judith didn't emerge from nowhere. It grew like a cancer, fed by financial stress and emotional exhaustion and a fundamental inability to see the elderly woman as anything other than a problem to be solved. The insurance policy was the key to everything. Without it, murder would have been pointless. Just risk without reward. But with it, murder became a business transaction. Judith was worth more dead than alive, at least in the cold calculus of her killers. The premium payments were an investment. Her death would be the return, and the method of her killing, suffocation, would leave investigators with few clues and even fewer questions. What strikes me most about this phase of the investigation is how normal everything appeared from the outside. The killers didn't behave like killers. They went to work. They attended church. They complained about their bills and gossiped about their neighbors and did all the things that normal people do. The mask they wore was so complete, so convincing that no one thought to look beneath it. But behind closed doors, the planning continued. The discussions about timing, the calculations about alibis, the careful consideration of what could go wrong and how to prevent it. These conversations happened in kitchens and living rooms, in the quiet hours of the night, when the rest of the world was sleeping. And through it all, Judith remained unaware, trusting the very people who were measuring her life in dollars and cents. The partnership between the two killers deserves special attention here, because it challenges so many of our assumptions about how murder works. In crime fiction and true crime alike, we typically imagine a single killer, a lone wolf, driven by demons that only they can hear. But the Clarke and Straub killings were different. They were collaborative, they required planning and coordination. They required trust between the killers themselves, a bond that seems almost obscene given the context. How do two people decide to kill together? How do they broach the subject? How do they test each other's willingness and commitment? These are questions that investigators and psychologists have grappled with for years, and the answers are rarely satisfying. The truth is that evil often emerges gradually, one small compromise at a time. It starts with a complaint. It evolves into a fantasy, and then somewhere along the line, the fantasy becomes a plan, and the plan becomes an action. And what was once unthinkable becomes not just thinkable, but doable. For the killers in this story, the bridge from thought to action was built on financial desperation and moral bankruptcy. They told themselves stories to justify what they were doing. Judith was suffering. Judith was a burden. Judith would be better off dead. And these rationalizations are as old as murder itself, and they carry the same weight now that they always have, which is to say, none at all, because there is no justification for what was done. There is only explanation, and explanation is not the same as excuse. The days before Judith's death passed without incident. There was no dramatic confrontation, no moment of revelation, no chance for the victim to escape her fate. She simply lived her diminished life day after day, unaware that each sunset brought her closer to her last. The cruelty of this knowledge, of knowing what was coming while the victim remained blissfully ignorant, is almost too much to contemplate. But contemplate it we must, because the victims of these crimes deserve our full attention. They deserve to be seen not as statistics or case numbers, but as human beings whose lives were stolen by people they should have been able to trust. When the night finally came, Judith went to bed as she always did. She said whatever she said to whoever was with her, words that have been lost to history, but that probably consisted of the small talk that fills our lives. Good night. Sleep well. See you in the morning. Ordinary words that took on extraordinary weight given what would follow. She fell asleep, and then she didn't wake up. The official cause of death was listed as natural causes, a determination that would stand for years before being challenged and overturned. To the outside world, Judith's death was sad but expected. She was old, she was sick. Her body had simply given out. The funeral was held. The tears were shed. And life went on, at least for everyone except Judith. But here's what the killers didn't anticipate. Death has a way of leaving traces that can't be easily erased. Not physical traces necessarily, though those exist too, but patterns, behaviors, financial records that tell their own story if you know how to read them. And eventually someone would learn to read them. Someone would notice that the deaths were coming too frequently, that the insurance policies were too convenient, that the grief was too performative to be genuine, that someone was years away from stepping forward, but she was already watching, already remembering, already storing away the details that would eventually crack this case wide open. She was just a child, too young to fully understand what she was witnessing, but old enough to sense that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. And so the killers moved on to their next victim, confident that they had perfected their craft, certain that they would never be caught. They had no idea that time was already running out, that the seeds of their destruction had already been planted and that justice, though patient, was already on its way. After Judith Hawkey's death, the killers made a mistake that criminals throughout history have made. They got greedy, they looked at their success, and instead of feeling grateful for having escaped detection, they felt entitled to more. The insurance money had solved some problems, but not all of them. There were still debts, still frustrations, still the gnawing sense that life had cheated them out of what they deserved. And so they began looking for their next victim. This is where the story transforms from a single tragedy into a serial killing, from an isolated act of evil into a pattern of predation that would claim multiple lives before it was finally stopped. And this is where we need to pause and talk about something uncomfortable. The fact that these killers operated in plain sight for years, that their crimes went undetected by law enforcement, by social services, by all the institutions that are supposed to protect vulnerable people. I'm not saying this to attack these institutions. I'm saying it because it's true and because the truth matters. The systems we have built to protect the elderly and disabled are inadequate. They are understaffed and underfunded. They are designed to assume good faith in caregivers, which is usually appropriate but sometimes catastrophic. And they failed the victims of the Clarke and Straub killings in ways that should haunt us all. The next victim fit the same profile as Judith: elderly, disabled, dependent on caregivers who'd been entrusted with their well-being, covered by an insurance policy that made their death financially advantageous to those who were supposed to be protecting them. The killers had refined their method now. They knew what worked and what didn't. They knew how to avoid suspicion. And they knew that the window between death and discovery needed to be carefully managed. The murder itself followed the same pattern as before: a pillow, pressure applied until breathing stopped, a body left to be discovered in a way that suggested natural causes, and then the familiar routine of grief performed for public consumption. Tears shed for people who weren't looking closely enough to see that the tears were as false as everything else about these women. But something was different this time. Something had shifted in the household, a presence that the killers couldn't control and couldn't eliminate. A 13-year-old girl was now living under the same roof. A girl who saw things she wasn't supposed to see, who heard conversations she wasn't supposed to hear, and who possessed a moral compass that her caregivers had somehow failed to destroy. This girl, whose name I'm withholding to protect her privacy, would become the hero of this story. Not a hero in the traditional sense, not someone who burst through doors or made dramatic arrests, but a hero nonetheless because she had the courage to remember, the patience to wait, and the integrity to eventually speak the truth when speaking the truth was the hardest thing in the world to do. She lived in an impossible situation. The people around her were killers. She knew it, or at least suspected it, from a young age. But what could she do? She was a child, dependent on these same people for her survival. She had no money, no resources, no ability to simply walk away. And so she did what survivors often do. She adapted. She learned to navigate a household built on secrets and lies. She learned to watch without seeming to watch, to listen without seeming to listen, to store away information that might someday become useful. The killers, meanwhile, grew bolder with each success. They had killed twice now, maybe more, and nothing had happened. No investigations, no accusations, no consequences of any kind. In their minds, they had achieved something approaching invincibility. They had cracked the code. They had figured out how to profit from death without paying any price for it. And they began to plan their next move with something approaching casual confidence. This is the phase of the story that I find most disturbing, not the murders themselves, though those are horrifying enough, but the normalcy that surrounded them. The killers didn't live in constant fear of discovery. They didn't jump at every knock on the door. They simply went about their lives, secure in the knowledge that they had gotten away with murder and could get away with it again. The banality of their evil is what makes it so chilling. Meanwhile, investigations that should have been opened remained closed. Questions that should have been asked remained unasked. The deaths accumulated, each one accepted as natural, each one generating its payout, each one adding to the growing fortune of the killers. And through it all, a teenage girl watched and remembered, building the case that would eventually bring the whole enterprise crashing down. I want you to think about something as we continue this story. Think about the people in your life who are vulnerable, the elderly relatives in nursing homes, the disabled neighbors who depend on caregivers, the children who can't speak for themselves. Now think about what it would take for someone to harm them. Think about the warning signs you might miss, the assumptions you might make, the trust you might place in people who don't deserve it. This is what keeps investigators awake at night. This is what haunts the families of victims long after the trials are over and the sentences are served. The knowledge that evil can wear a familiar face, that the people we trust most are sometimes the people we should trust least, that the systems we rely on for protection are only as good as the people who operate them. The Clarke and Straub killings weren't prevented by any system. They were eventually solved because one brave girl refused to stay silent. But think about all the cases that never get solved, all the victims whose deaths are never questioned, all the killers who never face justice. Think about the Judiths out there right now, vulnerable and afraid, dependent on people who may or may not have their best interests at heart. What would you do if you suspected something was wrong? Would you speak up? Would you risk the consequences? Would you be willing to challenge powerful people, to endure their anger and their threats, to stand alone against forces that would prefer you stay silent? These are the questions that the young girl in this story had to answer. And the answer she gave would determine whether the killers would continue their spree or finally face the justice they had evaded for so long. But we're not there yet. We're still in the middle of the horror, still watching as the body count climbs and the killers grow ever more confident in their invincibility. The third victim would die the same way as the first two, and the fourth, and possibly others whose deaths have never been fully accounted for. Each one represented a human life extinguished for profit. Each one represented a failure of the systems that should have protected them, and each one brought the killers one step closer to the reckoning that was coming, though they couldn't see it yet. Leave me a comment below. What would you have done in this girl's position? Would you have found the courage to speak up knowing the risks? Or would you have stayed silent, waiting for someone else to notice what was happening? I'm genuinely curious what you think, because this question gets to the heart of what this story is really about. It's not just about murder. It's about complicity and silence and the moral choices we make when the stakes are highest. The killers, meanwhile, had no idea that their time was running out. They continued their planning, continued their scheming, continued their assumption that they were untouchable. And they had no idea that a teenage girl was keeping track of everything. They had no idea that their perfect crime was about to unravel. And they had no idea that the justice they had escaped for so long was finally inexorably coming for them. Her name doesn't matter for our purposes. What matters is what she saw, what she remembered, and what she eventually found the courage to reveal. She was 13 years old when the killings began, an age when most children are concerned with school and friends and the small dramas of adolescent life. But her life was never normal. Her life was defined by secrets she couldn't share and fears she couldn't express, and a growing awareness that the people responsible for her care were also responsible for ending the lives of others. I've thought a lot about what it must have been like for her, living in that house, surrounded by that evil. Children are perceptive. They notice things that adults miss, file away details that adults dismiss. They know when something is wrong, even if they can't articulate exactly what it is. And this girl knew. She knew from the whispered conversations that stopped when she entered a room. She knew from the insurance documents she found hidden in drawers. She knew from the way certain elderly relatives seemed to die just a little too conveniently, just a little too profitably. But knowing and proving are two different things. Suspecting and acting are two different things. And a 13-year-old girl in a household controlled by killers has precious few options available to her. She couldn't go to the police. Who would believe her? She couldn't run away. Where would she go? She couldn't confront her caregivers directly. The consequences would have been unimaginable. And so she did the only thing she could do. She watched, and she waited, and she remembered. The killers, to their credit, or perhaps their discredit, never suspected her. She was just a child, after all. What could she possibly know? What could she possibly do? They talked freely in her presence, assuming she wasn't paying attention or wouldn't understand what she heard. They left documents where she could find them, assuming she wouldn't know what they meant. They underestimated her in every possible way, and that underestimation would prove to be their undoing. Years passed. The girl grew older. She graduated from middle school to high school, from childhood to adolescence. And throughout it all, she carried her burden in silence. The weight of what she knew pressed down on her every single day. She couldn't escape it, couldn't set it aside, couldn't pretend that her family was normal when she knew the terrible truth about what they had done. I've spoken with psychologists who study the effects of living in such environments, and they all say the same thing. The trauma is profound and lasting. Children who grow up with secrets like these often struggle with trust, with relationships, with their own sense of identity. They learn to suppress their emotions, to hide their thoughts, to present a false face to the world, because showing their true face feels too dangerous. And they carry the guilt of their silence, even when that silence was the only rational choice available to them. The girl in our story carried all of these burdens and more. She lived with the knowledge that people had died, that she could have potentially saved them if she had spoken up sooner, that her silence made her complicit in some way, even though she was also a victim herself. These are the kinds of thoughts that destroy people from the inside out, that lead to depression and anxiety and self-destruction. And yet she survived. She more than survived. She became strong enough to eventually do what needed to be done. The turning point came when she was 17 years old enough to begin imagining a life outside the household, old enough to understand that the choices she made now would determine the kind of person she would become. She had been carrying her secret for 4 years at that point. 4 years of watching and waiting and wondering if anyone would ever notice what was happening. And she realized, with a clarity that surprised her, that no one was going to notice. No one was going to rescue her. If justice was going to come, she would have to be the one to bring it. This decision didn't happen overnight. It emerged gradually over weeks and months of internal struggle. She thought about what would happen if she talked. The killers would deny everything. Her word against theirs. A troubled teenager making accusations against respectable adults. Who would believe her? What evidence did she have? Could she prove anything? Or would she simply be destroying her own life while letting the killers escape once again? These were the questions that kept her awake at night. These were the calculations she ran over and over in her head, trying to find a path forward that wouldn't end in disaster. And eventually, she found one. Not a perfect path, not a guaranteed path, but a path that at least offered a chance of success. She began keeping records, written notes about what she had witnessed when she had witnessed it, who was present, what was said. She documented the insurance policy she had seen, the amounts, the beneficiaries, the timing relative to the deaths. She created a timeline of the killings, noting the patterns that connected them. She was building a case, piece by piece, the same way a detective would, except she was doing it alone, in secret, with no training and no resources, and no one to turn to for help. The killers remained oblivious. They continued their planning, their scheming, their confident assumption that they had gotten away with everything. They had no idea that a teenage girl in their own household was meticulously documenting their crimes. They had no idea that she was waiting for the right moment to come forward. And they had no idea that their years of impunity were about to come to a sudden and dramatic end. The moment came in 2011. The girl, now a young woman, had graduated from high school and was beginning to build an independent life for herself. She had the documentation she had been gathering for years. She had the courage that had been growing inside her all that time. And she had something else, something that would prove decisive. She had access to a sympathetic ear, someone in a position of authority who was willing to listen to her story and take it seriously. I won't reveal how this connection was made or who this person was, out of respect for the privacy of everyone involved. What I can tell you is that when the girl finally sat down to tell her story, when she finally unleashed the flood of information she had been holding back for years, the response was immediate and overwhelming. The authorities had no idea that any of this had been happening. They had accepted the deaths as natural, just as the killers had intended. But now, with this new information, they began to look at the cases with fresh eyes, and what they found horrified them. Detective Michael Cardiman would later say that the Clarke and Straub case was the most disturbing he had ever worked. And this was a man who had seen a lot during his years with the Stark County Sheriff's Office. He had investigated murders, rapes, robberies, all the dark deeds that humans inflict upon each other. But nothing had prepared him for what he would discover once he began pulling at the threads of this case. It started with the young woman's testimony. She came to the authorities with her documentation, her timeline, her detailed accounts of what she had witnessed over the years. And from the very first interview, Cardamon knew he was dealing with something extraordinary. This wasn't a troubled teenager making wild accusations. This was a meticulous, credible witness who had spent years preparing for this moment. Her information was detailed, consistent, and verifiable. The first step was to review the deaths she had identified. The official records listed them all as natural causes, deaths that had been accepted without question at the time they occurred. But now, with the benefit of the young woman's information, the investigators began to see patterns that should have been obvious all along. The same people were present at multiple deaths. The same insurance arrangements preceded multiple deaths. The same method appeared to have been used in multiple deaths. Suffocation is called the silent killer for a reason. It leaves few traces if done carefully. There's no gunshot wound, no stab mark, no ligature bruise around the neck. The victim simply stops breathing. And unless someone is looking specifically for signs of foul play, the death can easily be attributed to natural causes, especially in elderly or disabled victims. The killers had exploited this fact expertly, choosing their method specifically because they knew it would be difficult to detect. But difficult doesn't mean impossible. And once the investigators knew what to look for, they began finding evidence that had been overlooked in the original death investigations. Medical records that showed victims were healthier than expected immediately before their deaths. Insurance policies taken out at suspicious times. Witnesses who remembered hearing arguments about money in the days before certain deaths occurred. Piece by piece, the picture began to come together. The exhumations were the hardest part. The families of the victims had buried their loved ones, believing they had died of natural causes. Now they were being asked to approve the digging up of those graves, the examination of remains that had been at rest for years. Some families agreed immediately, desperate for answers to questions they hadn't even known to ask. Others resisted, unable to accept that the deaths they had grieved might have been something other than what they appeared. The forensic examinations were conducted with painstaking care. The bodies had been buried for years, and decomposition had taken its toll. But even so, the medical examiners found evidence that supported the young woman's account. Certain injuries consistent with suffocation, certain anomalies that were difficult to explain through natural causes alone. Certain findings that, taken together, painted a picture of deliberate killing rather than peaceful passing. Detective Cardamon and his team began conducting interviews. They spoke to neighbors, to friends, to family members, to anyone who might have information about the killers and their victims. And as they talked to more and more people, a clearer picture began to emerge. The killers had been hiding in plain sight for years. They had been careful, but not careful enough. They had left traces, and those traces were now being followed to their inevitable conclusion. The financial records were particularly damning. The investigators obtained court orders to access the killers' bank accounts, their insurance records, their tax returns, and what they found was a roadmap of murder for profit. Money coming in from insurance policies within days of deaths occurring. Debts being paid off with suspicious timing. Lifestyle improvements that coincided with the deaths of vulnerable people. I want you to understand something about this phase of the investigation. What the detectives were doing was painstaking, tedious work. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't exciting. It was hours upon hours of reviewing documents, conducting interviews, and building a case that would hold up in court. Television shows compress this process into montages that last a few minutes. In reality, it took months of effort by dedicated professionals who refused to let the victims' deaths go unavenged. Throughout this time, the killers remained unaware that they were under investigation. They went about their lives as usual, secure in their assumption that they had gotten away with everything. They had no idea that search warrants were being prepared, that arrest warrants were being drafted, that the walls were closing in from every direction. Their confidence, which had served them so well for so long, was about to become their undoing. The young woman who had come forward continued to cooperate with investigators. She provided additional information as she remembered it, clarified details that had been unclear, identified potential witnesses who might be able to corroborate her account. Her bravery in those months cannot be overstated. She knew that if the killers discovered what she was doing, the consequences could be severe. But she had made her decision, and she was committed to seeing it through. The day of the arrests was carefully choreographed. The killers were taken into custody simultaneously, preventing either from warning the other. They were read their rights, transported to separate facilities, and subjected to the full weight of the criminal justice system. For years, they had operated above the law. Now they would answer to it. The initial interrogations were fascinating from a psychological perspective. Each killer responded to custody differently. One showed immediate signs of stress, requesting a lawyer almost immediately and refusing to answer questions. The other attempted to maintain innocence, spinning stories that contradicted the evidence investigators had already gathered. Neither fully understood how much the authorities knew or how completely their partnership had been exposed. The evidence presented to them during interrogation was overwhelming. The financial records, the medical findings, the testimony of witnesses, and most damaging of all, the detailed account provided by the young woman who had watched them for years. Faced with this mountain of evidence, even their carefully constructed defenses began to crumble. But the road to justice was far from over. Building a case and proving it in court are two different things. And the prosecutors would have to convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt that these women had committed murder, multiple murders, in a methodical scheme to profit from the deaths of their victims. And the defense attorneys, who were already preparing their strategies, would do everything in their power to prevent that from happening. The trial of the Clarke and Straub killers was expected to be straightforward. The evidence was overwhelming. The witnesses were credible. The prosecution had built an airtight case that seemed destined for conviction. But criminal trials are never predictable, and this one would take a turn that no one anticipated. The plot twist came not from the defense table, but from the prosecution's own investigation. As they continued to dig into the backgrounds of the killers, they discovered something that would fundamentally change the nature of the case. The killings had not begun in 2011. They had not begun in 2010 or 2009. The pattern of suspicious deaths connected to these women stretched back years further than anyone had realized, possibly decades. The original investigation had focused on the deaths that the young woman had directly witnessed or heard about. But when investigators expanded their search, they found a trail of bodies that seemed to follow the killers throughout their adult lives. former spouses who had died unexpectedly, elderly relatives who had passed away conveniently, friends and acquaintances who had named the killers as beneficiaries before meeting premature ends. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. These weren't opportunistic killers who had stumbled into murder. These were serial killers in the truest sense of the word. Women who had refined their technique over years or possibly decades, who had learned from each success and become more confident with each death they caused. The prosecution faced a difficult decision. Should they expand the charges to include the newly discovered deaths? This would strengthen the overall case by establishing a clear pattern, but it would also complicate the trial, potentially confusing jurors and giving the defense more opportunities to create doubt. Or should they focus on the deaths they could prove most conclusively, sacrificing the broader picture for a more manageable prosecution? In the end, they chose a middle path. The primary charges would remain focused on the deaths that were best documented and most clearly connected to the defendants. But the prosecution would introduce evidence of the earlier deaths as well, establishing the pattern of behavior that defined these killers and rebutting any defense claims that the charged deaths were isolated incidents or tragic coincidences. The defense responded with a strategy that would become increasingly desperate as the trial progressed. They attacked the credibility of the young woman who had come forward, characterizing her as troubled, unreliable, motivated by revenge against caregivers who had done their best for her. They challenged the forensic evidence, bringing in their own experts to cast doubt on the medical findings. And they attempted to shift blame between the two defendants, each side suggesting that if any crimes had been committed, the other woman was primarily responsible. This last strategy, known in legal circles as pointing the finger at your co-defendant, is a classic desperation move. It acknowledges, at least implicitly, that crimes were committed while attempting to minimize one defendant's culpability at the expense of the other. It's a risky strategy because it requires the jury to believe that one defendant was merely a follower or a dupe, someone who was manipulated into participating in crimes they wouldn't have committed on their own. The prosecution countered by emphasizing the partnership between the killers. They presented evidence showing that both women had benefited financially from the deaths, that both had been present at critical moments, that both had participated in the planning and execution of the murders. This wasn't a case of a mastermind and a follower. This was a case of two equal partners in evil, each as culpable as the other. The trial lasted several weeks and generated intense media coverage. The courtroom was packed every day with journalists, family members of the victims, and members of the public drawn by the horrific nature of the crimes. The testimony was often difficult to hear, as witnesses described the final days of victims who had trusted their killers completely, who had died believing they were safe in the care of family. The young woman who had started it all took the stand and delivered testimony that would prove decisive. She spoke clearly and directly, describing what she had witnessed, what she had heard, what she had documented over the years. The defense attorneys attempted to rattle her, to find inconsistencies in her account, to paint her as unreliable. But she held firm, answering every question with the same calm clarity that had characterized her from the beginning. When she was asked why she had waited so long to come forward, she gave an answer that silenced the courtroom. She said that she had been a child, that she had been afraid, that she had been dependent on the very people she was now accusing. She said that she had spent years gathering her courage, gathering her evidence, waiting for the moment when she could speak without being silenced. And she said that she hoped her testimony would bring justice to the victims who could no longer speak for themselves. The jury deliberated for less than a day before returning guilty verdicts on multiple counts of murder. The courtroom erupted when the verdicts were read. A mixture of relief and grief, and something approaching closure for the families who had waited so long for answers. The killers, for their part, showed little reaction, their faces blank, as they heard the words that would determine the rest of their lives. The sentencing phase would come later, but the outcome was never really in doubt. The crimes were too serious, the evidence too overwhelming, the victims too numerous for anything other than the harshest possible punishment. The killers who had operated with impunity for so long would finally pay the price for what they had done. The courtroom was silent as Judge David Furry prepared to deliver his sentence. The trial had lasted weeks. The evidence had been overwhelming. The jury had spoken. Now it was time for the final act, the moment when justice would be formally pronounced and the killers would learn their fate. I want you to imagine what that courtroom felt like. The families of the victims, who had waited years for this moment, sitting in the gallery with tears streaming down their faces. The investigators who had worked countless hours building this case, finally seeing their efforts vindicated. The young woman who had started it all, watching the people who had terrorized her childhood, finally face the consequences of their actions. And at the defense table, the two killers who had thought they were invincible, who had believed they had found a way to profit from death without ever paying a price, they sat there, stripped of their power, stripped of their freedom, waiting to hear how long they would spend behind bars. The judge began by addressing the victims. He read their names aloud, one by one, acknowledging each life that had been taken. Judith Hawkey, and the others, whose names represented real people with real families who'd been robbed of their loved ones for nothing more than financial gain. The judge spoke of their vulnerability, their trust in the people who were supposed to care for them, their deaths at the hands of those they should have been able to trust most. Then he turned to the defendants, and what he said to them was not just a sentence. It was an indictment of everything they had done, everything they had become, everything they represented about the darkest possibilities of human nature. He spoke of their greed, their calculation, their complete absence of remorse. He spoke of the years they had spent planning and executing their crimes, the sophistication of their methods, the cold-blooded nature of their enterprise. He spoke of the victims they had chosen, targeting the vulnerable specifically because they knew their deaths would be easier to explain, easier to conceal, easier to profit from. And then he pronounced a sentence. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. For both defendants, for each count of murder. The sentences would run consecutively, ensuring that neither woman would ever again walk free, would ever again have the opportunity to harm another vulnerable person. The moment was profound. Not because it brought back the dead, because nothing could do that. Not because it erased the pain the families had suffered, because that pain would last forever, but because it represented something essential about our society, about our commitment to justice, about our refusal to let the worst among us escape the consequences of their actions. The killers were led away in handcuffs, their confident facades finally crumbling. Whatever they had expected, whatever they had hoped for, it wasn't this. They had believed they were smarter than everyone else, that they had figured out a way to beat the system. And now the system had beaten them, definitively and permanently. Outside the courtroom, the families gathered to speak to the media. Their statements were a mixture of grief and gratitude, sorrow for what they had lost, and relief that justice had finally been served. They thanked the investigators, the prosecutors, and most of all, the young woman who had found the courage to come forward when no one else would. That young woman, now an adult, declined to speak publicly. She had done what she needed to do, and she wanted no part of the spotlight that her actions had created. She wanted only to move forward, to build a life that wasn't defined by the horrors of her childhood, to become something more than the girl who had watched murders happen and eventually found the courage to stop them. But her impact on the case, on the families, on the community couldn't be overstated. Without her, the killers would still be free. Without her, more victims would likely have died. Without her, justice would never have been served. She was the hero of this story, even if she never wanted to be called one. The aftermath of the trial brought other changes as well. And the case prompted a review of how deaths of vulnerable adults were investigated in Stark County and throughout Ohio. New protocols were established for examining deaths that occurred in caregiving situations. New training was provided to medical examiners and law enforcement personnel. The failures that had allowed the killers to operate for so long were identified and addressed, at least in part. None of this brought back the dead. None of this erased the pain that the families continued to feel. But it offered something valuable nonetheless. The assurance that lessons had been learned, that the system had improved, that future victims might be protected by the knowledge gained from this tragedy. The killers, meanwhile, began their sentences in the Ohio prison system. They would spend the rest of their lives behind bars, separated from each other, separated from the world they had terrorized, separated from any possibility of claiming more victims. Their partnership, which had been forged in greed and sealed in blood, was over forever. In the years since the trial, the ripples from the Clarke and Straub case have continued to spread. The families of the victims have struggled to rebuild their lives, to find some kind of peace in the aftermath of tragedy. The young woman who came forward has built a life for herself, one that she has deliberately kept private and protected from the public gaze. And the broader community has grappled with the implications of what happened, with the knowledge that such evil could flourish in their midst for so long without detection. I've followed this case for years, and I've seen how differently people respond to its resolution. Some find comfort in the fact that justice was served, that the killers are behind bars, that the system ultimately worked, even if it worked too slowly. Others find no comfort at all, pointing out that the victims are still dead, that their deaths could have been prevented, that the failures that allowed this to happen have only been partially addressed. Both responses are valid. The truth is that there are no perfect endings in true crime, no resolutions that fully repair the damage that has been done. The best we can hope for is justice, incomplete and imperfect, though it always is. And in this case, justice was achieved thanks largely to the courage of one young woman who refused to let the dead stay silent. The impact on caregiving practices in Ohio and beyond has been significant. The case became a teaching tool for those who train social workers, nurses, and other professionals who work with vulnerable populations. It illustrated the importance of looking beyond surface appearances, of questioning deaths that seem convenient, of never assuming that caregivers have their patients' best interests at heart simply because they're supposed to. Insurance companies also took notice. The pattern of policies being taken out on elderly and disabled victims, followed shortly by their deaths, prompted increased scrutiny of such arrangements. New protocols were implemented to flag suspicious patterns, to investigate claims more thoroughly, to prevent the financial incentives for murder that had driven the Clarke and Straub killings. None of these changes are foolproof. Determined killers will always find ways to exploit systems and avoid detection. But the changes made in the wake of this case have almost certainly saved lives, even if those lives can never be counted or acknowledged. The victims of the Clarke and Straub killings, in some sense, continue to protect others from beyond the grave. The young woman who came forward has moved on with her life. She has asked for privacy, and I will respect that request by not speculating about where she is now or what she is doing. What I can say is that her courage continues to inspire those who know her story. She was placed in an impossible situation, and she found a way to do the right thing, despite every obstacle that stood in her way. That kind of moral courage is rare, and it deserves to be celebrated, even as the person who demonstrated it seeks anonymity. The killers, in their prison cells, have had years to contemplate what they did. Whether they feel genuine remorse or simply regret at being caught is impossible to know. What is certain is that they will never again have the opportunity to harm anyone. The society they terrorized has been protected from them, permanently and irrevocably. I sometimes think about what might have happened if the young woman had never come forward. The killers would have continued their spree, that much is certain. More victims would have died. More insurance money would have been collected. More funerals would have been held, with more fake tears shed by killers who were already planning their next payday. But she did come forward. She broke the cycle. She stopped the killing. And in doing so, she demonstrated something important about human nature. That even in the darkest circumstances, even when evil seems to have won completely, there are still people who will stand up, who will speak out, who will refuse to be silent in the face of injustice. This is the legacy of the Clarke and Straub case. Not just the convictions, not just the sentences, not just the changes to policy and practice, but the reminder that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when the situation demands it. That courage doesn't require a badge or a gun, just the willingness to speak the truth. When speaking the truth is the hardest thing in the world to do. What can we learn from the Clarke and Straub suffocation killings? What truths does this case reveal about human nature, about our society, about the systems we've built to protect the vulnerable among us? The first lesson is one that true crime investigators know all too well. The people we trust most are often the people most capable of harming us. The victims in this case weren't killed by strangers. They were killed by family members, by caregivers, by people who had been given access to their lives, precisely because they were supposed to be trustworthy. This is a pattern that repeats across countless cases and it challenges us to think carefully about who we trust and why. The second lesson concerns the vulnerability of certain populations. Elderly and disabled people are disproportionately targeted by those who would exploit them precisely because their conditions make them easier to victimize and their deaths easier to explain away. The systems we've built to protect these populations are inadequate, underfunded, and too often reactive rather than proactive. The Clarke and Straub case should prompt us to think seriously about how we can do better. The third lesson is about the power of speaking up. For years, the young woman in this case carried her burden in silence, believing that no one would listen to her, that her word would never prevail against the adults who controlled her life. But when she finally found her voice, she changed everything. She brought down killers who had operated with impunity for years. She secured justice for victims who could no longer speak for themselves. And she demonstrated that one person, even a young person without resources or power, can make a difference when they commit to telling the truth. And the fourth lesson is about the limitations of our investigative systems. The deaths in this case were initially classified as natural causes, and that classification was accepted without question. It took years and an outside witness to prompt the kind of investigation that should have happened from the beginning. This failure wasn't the result of malice or incompetence. It was the result of systems that assume good faith, that accept surface explanations, that lack the resources to scrutinize every death that occurs in caregiving situations. We need to think carefully about how these systems can be improved. The fifth lesson is about justice itself. The trial and conviction of the Clarke and Straub killers represented a victory for the system, a demonstration that even the most careful criminals can eventually be brought to account. But it also represented a failure because justice came too late to save the victims, because the killers operated freely for years before being stopped, because the damage they caused can never be fully repaired. Justice is necessary, but it is never sufficient. Prevention is always better than punishment. I want to take a moment to address those of you who may be in situations similar to the young woman in this case. If you suspect that someone is being harmed, if you're witnessing abuse or neglect or worse, I want you to know that your voice matters. It may not feel that way. It may feel like no one will believe you, that you have no power to change anything, that speaking up will only make your own situation worse. But the young woman in this case felt all those things, and she spoke up anyway, and she changed everything. There are resources available to you, hotlines you can call, agencies you can contact, people who are trained to listen and to investigate. You don't have to carry your burden alone. And even if your first attempt to speak up doesn't succeed, keep trying, keep documenting, keep waiting for the right moment. The truth has a way of coming out eventually, and when it does, it needs witnesses to speak for it. For those of you who work with vulnerable populations, I have a different message. Stay vigilant. Question assumptions. Look beyond surface appearances. The caregivers and family members you work with are usually exactly what they appear to be. Loving, dedicated people doing their best in difficult circumstances. But sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're predators who have found a particularly vulnerable pool of victims. And your vigilance may be the only thing that protects those victims from harm. For all of us, the Clarke and Straub case offers a reminder of our shared responsibility. We are all, in some sense, guardians of the vulnerable in our communities. We all have a role to play in noticing when something is wrong, in speaking up when we see red flags, in refusing to accept explanations that don't quite add up. The killers in this case operated as long as they did, partly because no one was paying attention, because their crimes fell through the cracks of a society that was too busy, too distracted, too willing to assume the best about people who deserved the worst. Let this case be a call to action. Let the memory of the victims inspire us to do better. And let the courage of the young woman who came forward remind us that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they commit to standing up for what's right. I began this story with a question. What if I told you that a 13-year-old girl would become the key to unraveling one of Ohio's most disturbing murder conspiracies? Now, 10 chapters later, you know the answer. She did it. Against all odds, against every obstacle, she did it. She watched her childhood consumed by evil. She lived with killers, ate meals with killers, smiled at killers when every instinct told her to run. She carried secrets that would have crushed most adults, let alone a child. And when the time was right, when she had the courage and the evidence and the opportunity, she stepped forward and brought the whole enterprise crashing down. The victims of the Clarke and Straub killings can never be brought back. Judith Hawkey and the others, they're gone forever. Their voices silenced, their lives cut short by greed and cruelty. But their deaths were not in vain. Because of the young woman's courage, their killers will spend the rest of their lives behind bars. Because of her testimony, changes have been made that will protect future victims. Because of her refusal to stay silent, justice was served. This is the resolution that true crime stories don't always get. Sometimes the killers escape. Sometimes the evidence is never found. Sometimes the witnesses are too afraid or too traumatized to come forward. But not this time. This time, good prevailed over evil. This time, courage triumphed over fear. This time, the story ended the way it should have ended, with the guilty punished and the innocent vindicated. But let me be clear about something. This ending, this justice, this resolution didn't happen automatically. It happened because one person made a choice. She could have stayed silent forever. She could have tried to forget what she had witnessed, to bury it deep inside and move on with her life. No one would have blamed her. No one would have known. The killers would have continued their spree, and the victims would have remained unavenged, and the story would have ended very differently. But she didn't stay silent. She chose to speak. She chose to fight. She chose to be the hero that the victims needed, even though being that hero cost her years of fear and uncertainty and pain. And because of her choice, everything changed. I tell you this because I want you to understand that justice is not inevitable. It requires human beings to make difficult choices, to take risks, to sacrifice their own comfort and safety for the sake of something larger than themselves. The young woman in this story made that choice. And I hope that if you're ever in a similar position, you'll remember her example and find the courage to do the same. The killers are in prison now, serving life sentences without the possibility of parole. They will grow old behind bars, separated from the world they terrorized, stripped of the power they once wielded. They will have decades to contemplate what they did, to remember the faces of their victims, to understand that their scheme, which seemed so clever, was ultimately their undoing. And somewhere out there, the young woman who stopped them is living her life, building a future, moving forward. She doesn't seek recognition or praise. She doesn't want to be defined by the worst experiences of her childhood. She wants only what all of us want: a chance to be happy, to be at peace, to be something more than the sum of her traumas. I think about her often. I think about what it took for her to do what she did. I think about all the times she must have been tempted to give up, to stay silent, to accept that some evils are too powerful to challenge. And I think about the moment when she finally decided that she couldn't stay silent any longer, that the victims deserved justice, that she was the only one who could deliver it. That moment, that choice, that courage, that's what this story is really about. Not the killings, not the trial, not even the victims, though they deserve to be remembered and honored. It's about the power that each of us has to stand up against evil, even when evil seems overwhelming, even when the odds seem impossible, even when everything we've been taught tells us to stay quiet and stay safe. The Clarke and Straub Suffocation killings ended in justice because one person refused to be silent. And wherever you are, whatever you're facing, I hope you carry that lesson with you, because the world needs more people like her. The world needs more people who are willing to speak the truth, even when the truth is dangerous. The world needs more heroes, and sometimes the heroes are 13-year-old girls who don't even know they're heroes yet. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it reminded you of the power of courage and the importance of justice, then please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the next story. And take a moment to think about the vulnerable people in your own life, the elderly relatives, the disabled neighbors, the children who can't speak for themselves. Think about how you can protect them. Think about how you can be their voice if they ever need one. Because at the end of the day, that's what this story teaches us. We are all connected. We are all responsible for each other. And when one person finds the courage to speak the truth, they light a flame that can never be fully extinguished. The victims of the Clarke and Straub killings are at peace now. Their killers are behind bars. And their story, their tragedy, their ultimate redemption through justice lives on in everyone who hears it and carries its lessons forward. This is where I leave you. But the story doesn't end here. It continues in you, in the choices you make, in the courage you find, in the justice you help to create. May you always find that courage when you need it most.